about to begin, and we will start with our welcome from Minister Dale Butler, the Minister of Culture and Social Rehabilitation. Please join me in welcoming Minister Butler.
Good evening, everyone. Ladies and gentlemen, Senator Mark Bean, Senator Teo Dill, to the Leader of the Opposition, Mr. Kim Swan, all of my parliamentary colleagues, both members of the government and the opposition who are here today, to members of our Bermuda-friendly societies, to all of the visiting and local dignitaries who are part of the African Diaspora Heritage Trail Conference, and to members of the public. Welcome to the land that is green and clean and serene. That's what we heard yesterday. I am pleased to be with you all this evening for this Friendly Society March organized jointly by the Department of Community and Cultural Affairs and the Friendly Societies of Bermuda. For those of you who are not familiar with the Friendly Societies of Bermuda, the first of these organizations were originally created prior to emancipation, and more were created post-emancipation. Friendly societies provided support for the black community in various ways, including organizing money lending schemes, establishing schools and churches, and fostering the performing arts. The purpose of this march this evening is to pay tribute to black fellowship and entrepreneurship, and as such, the march route will take us past various points of interest. Historical buildings you will see and receive commentary, and we are fortunate to have speakers at each point along the route, many of whom have ties to the people or places mentioned in the booklet you have received. We have a lot of ground to cover this evening, so I'd like to ask that as a group we stick together and move efficiently from one point to the next. At the end of the march, we will join the Somerset Brigade Marching Band, who will lead us to Manchester Unity Hall, where we'll have the opportunity to watch a dramatic enactment of the story of the Enterprise. Before we begin this march, I'd like to thank the many parties involved with organizing this event. The Emancipation Committee has done a tremendous job to taking this event from concept to reality. Thank you. Let's give them a hand. Thanks also to the Department of Community and Cultural Affairs. The team has done an impressive job of organizing this and all of the events for Emancipation this year. I'd also like to thank the Bermuda Police Service, which is providing us with support and assistance tonight. And finally, I would like to thank all of the friendly societies who have shared their rich history, heritage, and tradition of marching with us this evening. And now, onto the march, we'll receive directions from our Senior Cultural Officer, Mrs. Heather Whalen.
We're going to begin here with two speakers, Melissa Clark, and then followed by Jay Butler. And then we will start walking.
Good evening. When we talk about emancipation, there are many events that are highlighted leading up to the event. The slave rebellions, Sally Bassett, and the abolitionist movement. We talk about things that happen after, to those who were slaves here and were freed here. But there are some stories that don't fit this mold, that are a bit more out of the ordinary when we think of emancipation. This is one of these stories. In 1835, the year after slavery was abolished in the British colonies, an American ship called the Enterprise landed on this site, having been blown off course during a hurricane. The ship had been sailing off the coast of the mainland on its way from Alexandria, Virginia to the Carolinas. It didn't take long for the people of Bermuda to discover what sort of cargo the ship carried. They had 78 slaves on board, many of them children, both black and Native American. There was much debate as to what would happen to all the slaves on board. Whose property were they, or were they anyone's property at all? The Friendly People's Society helped to lead the campaign to have them freed. In the end, 72 of the 78 slaves chose freedom here on the island rather than return to slavery in America. Today, many Bermudians, including myself, can count themselves among the descendants of these people. Emancipation did not happen on one day alone and in one place. It happened several times over, all over the world. Even after the 1st of August, 1834, there are places that give freedom to those who are enslaved, whether mentally or physically. Emancipation is not only for a day, it's for every day. As the descendants of slaves and slave traders alike, we must take up the cause every day to not allow our fellow citizens, our fellow human beings, to continue to be enslaved. In this way, the Friendly Society have continued in their mission, assisting Black Bermudians in their successes, including my grandmother, Verona Trott, who many of you remember as a well-known teacher at Central School. Without scholarship from the Friendly Society, she would not have been able to attend the Berkeley Institute, from which she went on to college. Let this park and the other stops along this march remind you of that, for those who first set foot upon this rock in this place in 1835, this was their day of emancipation. Thank you.
Now we skip forward a bit. In 1951, a small group of Bermudians, including my grandparents, Georgine and the late Hilton Hill, my great-aunt Carol Hill, and my cousin, the late Eva Robinson, picketed the ticket offices of the Bermudiana Theatre on Front Street to protest against the theatre's segregationist policies. Though the theatre was located up on the hill here, where ACE now stands, the picketing actually took place a couple of blocks to our west at the ticket offices, which were next to the old Trimminghams building, which is now under construction. The picketers were all members of the New Theatre Guild, which had been formed by Miss Carol Hill upon her return from drama school in Canada. Shortly after the group formed, the Bermudiana Theatre advertised its intention to bring in well-known professional actors from overseas. Yet, the New Theatre Guild inquired as to how they could purchase tickets. The wind. Yet, when the New Theatre Guild inquired as to how they could purchase tickets, they were informed by the Bermudiana Theatre that one had to be a member. When they asked who could be a member, they were told that membership was restricted to those of unmixed European descent. The group decided that something must be done. Led by my grandfather Hilton Hill, who was then a member of Parliament, with his own photographic studio on Burnaby Street, they made placards and picketed in front of the theatre's ticket office. Georgine Hill and Evelyn McLaurin, the president of the Canadian University Women's Association, who was then visiting Bermuda, authored numerous letters of protest, and the group's cause attracted international coverage, with Actors Equity in the US voicing their support. The matter was eventually raised in Parliament in the UK, and the Governor of Bermuda was later instructed only to attend on nights open to the general public. Such was the pressure brought to bear by this small group on the theatre that the next season the theatre opened to everyone, regardless of race.
Hey.
Oh, I guess I should use this, shouldn't I? Yes. You can tell I'm unfamiliar with this type of operation. But anyhow, I think in every family there's a person who carries on, who passes on the information from one generation to the other. My aunt told me many years ago that she had an uncle who in 1876, at the age of 15, left Bermuda for Africa. That was his dream. So the next week, that was his dream. So off he went to Africa. In recent years, I saw an article in the Mid-Ocean News by Andy Birmingham, who said he'd been to the Historical Society and purchased 3 medals in an auction. I'm not used to this. These medals belong to a Fred Dolan, D-O-L-A-N. And I remembered my aunt telling me that our surname was D-O-L-A-N, but lost in translation, it became D-O-W-L-I-N-G. So I immediately knew that this man was a relative of ours. He was recruited by the British Army in South Africa to drive and maintain traction engines that the British soldiers were unaware of how to manage. For his efforts there, he received the Queen's Medal of South Africa. The shock that Mr. Birmingham received was when I turned up to tell him my part of the story, because this medal was only awarded to white soldiers. You can see I'm not white. He also went on and he became an able seaman in the Merchant Navy, and he received for his efforts there by the British the Mercantile Medal and the War Medal of 1914. The medals he received before from South Africa were from 1899. I'm testing my memory today. So he received these medals as an able seaman because to be an able seaman during wartime was one of the most hazardous occupations that they knew. He returned to Bermuda to visit his sister, Blanche Smith, at Franklin Lodge on Union Street, became ill and could not return to his family in South Africa, and he died at the Cottage Hospital. That's my part of the story. Thank you.
The notion of race itself, thank you, is based on a series of false tautologies, manufactured logic, or to be clear, just plain bad information about people, about ideas, about freedom. And the description of the circumstances leading up to the theater boycott by James Pierman, the president of the company that owned them here on the island in and around 1959, as a storm in a teacup, I think is representative of these fundamental, willful misunderstandings of humanity, rights, and justice. Because as we have all spent a lifetime benefiting from, and we'll hopefully spend the rest of our living days proudly honoring, the climate of change that the progressive group cultivated was not the quietly manageable set of cultural conflabs that the cliche implied. This was no ordinary storm, and this was definitely no ordinary teacup. The progressive group were not looking to bring rain or thunder or even just lightning. The theater boycott was a carefully calculated attempt to demonstrate the fundamental evil and stupidity of segregation by the most, I think, inherently futurist-minded folk in the community. Young people who knew that the next generation of young people had to be spared from the experience of practically applied state-sanctioned segregation. This was not a question of if, as the secret meetings at Rosalind and Edward Williams' home demonstrated, or even a question of how, as the undercover flyer campaign let folk know what was being done on their behalf, and even more importantly, why it was happening. And come June 15th, 1959, it wasn't even a question of when, as the boycott kicked off in earnest. By July 2nd, the movement, as stoked by the remarkable oratorical skills of Kingsley Tweed, Robert Smith, Richard Lynch, and Kenny Eben, had created a brand new context for this country, one in which racial segregation was no longer acceptable. The argument just did not work anymore on its logical merits, and most importantly, because the collective community truly understood exactly why the presumption of inferiority based on melanin content was so foolish as to be completely intolerable. What is slightly less intolerable, but perhaps just as sad, is that it took us 40 years to learn who these people were, who had saved us from the apathetic system's disregard of our own humanity really were. But in 1999, on the 40th anniversary of this epic event, we learned who they were and what they did for us, for who we are and who we're going to be. So please applaud and let's celebrate appropriately the progressive group who saved us for us. Stanley Rattery, the leader, Rosalind and Edward Williams, Clifford Wade, Marva Phillips, Coleridge Williams, Rudolph and Vera Commission, Clifford and Florence Maxwell, Eugene Woods, Esme and Lancelot Swan, Dr. Erskine Simmons, William Francis, William Walwyn, and Gerald and Isola Harvey. Please clap for them and what they did for us.
Dismond Drive. Dismond Drive is named for the city of Hamilton's first black mayor, Mr. Cecil R. Dismond. The Dismond family was well established and members of the family were respected city business people along with others in the immediate vicinity. Now Dismond Drive is right over here to our right here. The black entrepreneurs, Washington Lane, family businesses established on Church Street and in the area known as the Alley, included the Blue Jay Restaurant, which was owned by Mr. and Mrs. Vernon Jackson. Mrs. Jackson was the twin of W.L. Tucker and C.P., who owned the Tucker's Commission House on King Street. Now you can see this in Dr. Eva Hudson's second-class citizens, first-class men. Businesses owned and operated by blacks included shoemakers Mr. Nicky Francis and his wife Edith, Mr. Reed Johansson and Taylor, Mr. Ebenezer Lesper, Dismond Cycle Livery and Dismond Shoe Store, Dr. Millican's dental office. Now Dr. Can came from a family of doctors and professionals. The Imperial Hotel also, and the Milady's Dress Store, which was owned by Mrs. Della Place. And we thank you.
Early 20th centuries, as tourism became the main element of the Bermudian economy, a large number of hotels were located on Church Street. The American House Hotel was on the corner of Queen and Church Streets. The Hamilton Hotel was where City Hall car park now stands. The Imperial Hotel and the Seahorse Grill, now Thistle House, was, in quote, located in one of the best residential sections of the city of Hamilton, according to the 1946 edition of Bow's Beautiful Bermuda. It was at this hotel that the talented Bermudian jazz pianist and composer, Mr. Lance Hayward, conducted and performed with his orchestra. The Everest Hotel, an attractive home-like hotel, was nearly opposite the cathedral where the marketplace is now located. Victoria Hall was yet another hotel and was located behind City Hall. When tourism shifted from winter to summers at beach resorts, the city hotels were replaced by bigger buildings, hence the reason for more modern buildings we see today. On Burnaby Street, the prominent Samuel David Robinson's family owned the buildings which today hold the Jackson School of Dance and other businesses. The pink building to your left. In a different era, this building once housed the Robinson Clothing, Hat, Future businesses with the focus on being the Stirrerite. This business was left to Samuel David Robinson's children, in particular his grandson, Rue Bottom Hunt Robinson. Thank you. Thank you. Mark, let's go. Thank you.
I hope you've enjoyed your walk thus far. I would like to direct your attention to the house on the hill and the sign at that in that pink building. All right. I have the pleasure of informing those of you who are guests here on the ADHD Trail, as well as local folk, about John Herbert Taylor. He was born in 1882 and passed in 1943. Bermuda has one of the oldest parliaments in the Western Hemisphere, and the house on the hill behind me dates back to 1826. This imposing edifice with its Florentine facade looms over the humble three-room space where that young lady is standing. At the turn of the century, 1900 to be exact, a handsome blue and white sign on the window denoted the business of J.H. Taylor, leather merchant, boot, and shoemaker. The significance of his establishment is that it was dubbed Little Parliament, a second House of Parliament, or more profoundly, number 10 Downing Street. And I think those of you from the States will appreciate this even more if you look in today's paper, and you will see that Barack Obama is standing as straight as a die with number 10 over his head. That would be number 10 Downing Street. Why was this? And why John Herbert Taylor's shoe shop? His story stems from his Bermudian mother. When the salt ponds were washed away by a hurricane in the Turks Island, she returned to Bermuda with her youngest son. John Herbert Taylor's baptism into Bermudian culture in the late 1800s impacted on him significantly and charted his course in his new homeland. He was well-traveled as a merchant seaman. He was learned, industrious, cultivated, and affected by Bermuda's blatant racism. His heightened sensitivity and progressive nature thrust him into being a proactive citizen who would be instrumental in effecting change along with other change agents in the black community of the first half of the 20th century. Mr. Taylor's business was fortuitously located. It became the message center and the gathering place for those men who were politically astute. This venue was a hub of activity as colored members of Parliament and other politicians gathered to debate the issues before ascending the hill across the way to cast their vote on behalf of the interests of the black community. The iniquities of the day were threshed out by these men in this shoe shop beforehand. I hope you'll take the time to nip into Twice Told Tales and really see that space. John Herbert Taylor was an active politician. He had fought along with Dr. John Cann on education issues. He was president of the Pembroke Political Association in 1938 and a member of the parish vestry. He was a trustee of St. Paul's AME Church, as well as past noble father of Alexandrina Lodge. His obituary states he performed the political hat trick when he played a leading part in placing the late Hilton G. Hill, the Honorable Robert C. Crawford, OBE, and Mr. David Tucker in the House of Assembly for Pembroke. The strategies used by persons of color for increasing black representation and empowerment in colonial Bermuda have a long history. Those of the early and mid-1900s were threshed out in that small space right up the street there amidst cumbersome machinery, handmade shoes, and rows of shelves with leather hide as a backdrop in my grandfather's boot and shoe shop. John Herbert Taylor died in 1943 at the age of 61 of a heart attack. He was at a Pembroke Political Association meeting at Alexandrina Lodge, situated on the next block, within walking distance of his shop. May he rest in peace. Thank you.
Are we good to go? Good evening again, everybody. Excuse me. Now, I've been tasked to speak about the black parliamentarians that existed throughout our history, and I think to do so accurately, we first have to examine what it means to be black. And that is to say, what it means to be black on a very basic level, I think, is to recognize that in the construct of this society, such as it is that one is considered to be inferior, or more to the point that society believes that one is not deserving of freedom, liberty, and justice. Now, with that said, what it also means to be black is to understand that on those points, society is fundamentally wrong, and it must be convinced accordingly, reformed in the most powerful ways through the most powerful spaces available. Now, recognition of such a set of conflicting concepts doesn't just motivate, it obligates effort and focus. The sort of dedication, I suspect, at least in part,